Leftists in our generation love to say that the very topic of persecution of Christianity is nothing more than overblown misinformation, because they say Christianity is the oppressive force that makes up the patriarchy. In other words, you can't be oppressed if you're the oppressor. Well, a new report has a different take on this subject. Let's talk about that. The Family Research Council has issued their 2024 edition of their Religious Liberty Report, and they collect examples of Christians in the Western world who have what they call serious challenges to the ability to live according to their biblical beliefs. The report is full of anecdotal evidence, like Finland, where a Christian politician was prosecuted, a member of parliament. He was prosecuted for publicly expressing support of biblical marriage. In Canada, we know that churches were harassed during the pandemic for violating COVID-19 lockdown procedures. Only now, looking back, what we're discovering is that the government specifically made the requirements for churches more stringent than other businesses and organizations in the country. 2 Swedish nurses who applied for certification as midwives had those applications rejected, not because their credentials were inadequate, but because they both said that they would refuse to perform abortions. Even here in the United States, in Ohio, Pastor Chris Avell was prosecuted for allowing homeless people to sleep in his church's sanctuary on cold winter nights. Sean and Teresa Kellum couldn't receive a foster care license because they refused to support homosexuality and transgender ideology. The reality is, while we may not yet be seeing Christians in the West physically persecuted, the increasing restrictions that are attempting to limit our human rights to worship and to believe and to live according to the dictates of our conscience, those restrictions are becoming more common and more oppressive. It's interesting. You see this particularly in the Christian school movement. It's interesting for me because Evergreen has just started this year a new Christian school, Evergreen Academy. And so I follow with interest when I run across news stories about what's happening to Christian schools across our country. The reality is the movement of Christian schools is catching on. It is spreading like wildfire, with new schools starting in many cities across the nation. But the secular educational establishment, and frankly its media allies, are upset precisely because of their secularism, their liberal theories of education, their progressive ideologies, and frankly, their educational failures. They're upset about Christian schools because the movement is growing, and it's growing quickly. What makes the Christian school model so powerful is its comprehensive continuity with the educational models that produced literature and thinking citizens while sharpening and strengthening Western civilization. In other words, what Christian schools are doing is standing in a long line of educational practices that produced Western civilization. In fact, that's really the problem. The secular educational establishment is driven absolutely crazy, not just because Christian schools are Christian, but because they support the learning and the appreciation of the very things that the secular establishment stands against, which is a defense and a celebration of Western civilization. You see, here's the lesson. Anyone in our generation who defends the lasting truths and values of Western civilization is now a white nationalist. And what's fascinating is you can be a white nationalist and not even be white. If you take on the educational establishment, you will be hated. All you have to do is briefly examine the vitriol aimed at simple housewives who, out of concern for their children's education, started an organization that they innocuously enough named Moms for Liberty. Who can be against mothers and who can be against liberty? Well, I'll tell you who. The entire secular educational establishment. They don't like the idea that their ideologies, their transformational philosophies are questioned by housewives who are simply saying, I want my child to appreciate the world that they've been given, to understand the flow of Western civilization, how they stand in a legacy, both a spiritual legacy of the history of Christianity and a political legacy of the greatest political experiment in human history, the American experiment. Listen, Christian schools take a lot of criticism, and frankly, I'll be the first to admit that no school is perfect. But if you can drive the liberal establishment crazy and lead it to respond with this much fury and anger, frankly, you must be doing something big and you must be doing something right. And that's worth our attention. How do we move forward with this idea of Christianity being restricted and attacked? If not physically, then certainly the attack of limiting our practices, of denying the legitimacy of our values, of silencing our voices in the public square. Well, let me tell you how this gets really crazy. In Great Britain right now, they have passed a law that is casually referred to as the buffer zone law. What Parliament has done is they created a law which prohibits public gatherings within 492 feet of an abortion business. Now, heaven only knows where they got 492 feet. But for some reason, that's the magical line that is necessary to protect a business that is so philosophically and intellectually vapid that it can't stand even the possibility of intellectual conversation or debate. 492 feet, you can't stand within that circle of any abortion business. The problem becomes how to enforce this buffer zone law. Astonishingly, the challenge for law enforcement officials is that the law includes prohibitions, get this, prohibitions on silent prayer. Now, you can find filmed examples of encounters in Great Britain of people who are simply standing on street corners. They're not singing, they're not preaching, they're not yelling at anybody, they're not blocking access. They're simply standing within the magic bubble around abortion businesses. And they're approached by law enforcement who have to inquire as to why they're there. One woman recently just settled for $17,000 in a settlement with the government because Isabel Vaughan Spruce was a British citizen who was arrested outside an abortion business, not blocking access, simply within that 500-foot bubble. And she admitted to the police officers that she might be praying in her head. When they approached her, they asked what she was doing, and she said, I'm just standing here. And they said, are you praying? And she said, I might be praying silently in my head. And they arrested her. Now here's the thing. You can't imagine in your wildest dreams that the British government would authorize the arrest of Muslims praying 5 times a day in public places. In fact, the call to prayer can be heard in sections of London 5 times a day. Somehow that's okay. Nobody's going to arrest Muslims for praying, only Christians. But then here's the flip side of that. No other religion is gathering near abortion clinics to pray for the end of the most godless and horrendous practice in Western civilization today. Of course she was a Christian. But praying silently in her head got her arrested. Now here's the thing. Whatever guidance, whatever instruction the government gives us about what we may or may not do as Christians, I'm here to tell you today that we need to begin preparing our minds for the day when we are willing to defy such crazy and bizarre restrictions. It's not that we want to be contentious, but frankly, freedom of thought and freedom to seek the presence of God is fundamental to the way that we live our lives. No other freedoms can exist without these freedoms. And the government has now decided not only to restrict our actions, but now they're arresting people for what might be happening silently in their head. This has a very George Orwell feel to it. Laws that attempt to defy the moral and natural order, frankly, they deserve to be broken. What if every Christian began treating irrational and evil laws, procedures, or even social norms as they ought to be treated, by refusing to comply? What if we refused to put our preferred pronouns on our medical forms? What if we stopped walking past the LGBTQ pride display at the library without at least mentioning politely to the librarian that I just want you to know that I don't want this here and kids don't want or deserve this? What if we explicitly demanded the pediatrician, the nurse, or the teacher not to speak to our children about their gender identity? What if we hold schools accountable about allowing children to pretend to be a different gender at school, even using different names, without telling the parents? If these buffer zone arrest videos coming out of the United Kingdom are any indication, the people tasked with enforcing these laws realize how absurd they are. In fact, most of the time, these policies aren't written by actual law enforcement officers. They're not written by self-respecting medical professionals or even conscientious teachers. They're written by bureaucrats and grandstanders who will never actually have to put their bad ideas into practice. They just delegate those bad ideas to be carried out by other people. Cultural wins are a number game. These laws and policies and norms, they got traction in the first place because people with bad ideas applied good pressure. Christians ought to start applying the same kind of pressure, just aimed in the right direction. Are we praying? Ask me that. Are we praying? The answer is yes, we are. Why? Would you like to join us? Well, none of this is a surprise to those who are biblically literate. In 2 Timothy chapter 3, verse 12, Paul says, "Indeed, all who want to live in a godly way in Christ Jesus will be persecuted." The fact that Western civilization has not significantly persecuted us before now, that's the exception, not the rule. The rule for 2,000 years is that Christians have been persecuted everywhere they've lived in every generation. We're simply catching up because what was once a civilization founded on a Judeo-Christian worldview has now lost that foundation and drifted into an ocean of secularism in which our values are now seen to be extreme and even dangerous. Well, at the end of this road, it's not just the control of our actions and the attempt to control our thoughts. When that fails by law and by enforcement, we see typically the move in society then moves to physical persuasion, aka bodily persecution. The 11th chapter of Hebrews has a section that talks about the great heroes of faith in the Old Testament. And while some of them seem to be fairly successful in the lives that they put on display for us in the Bible, there are some interesting verses in Hebrew 11 because it calls attention to people who, by human standards, were not just not successful, they were colossal failures. Their lives ended in execution and suffering. And the question is, how did these people make it into a hall of fame related for those who live by faith? Let me read you these verses. just speaking, if you've ever seen Hebrews chapter 11, it starts with the writer giving us names of heroes in the Old Testament. But as he progressively speeds up, he ceases to give us names and he just begins to describe situations. It's like he's thinking of more heroes in the Old Testament than he can even have time to write on the page. And so he says this, speaking about people that by human standards, as I've said, they were colossal failures, but he said they pleased God by their faith. Listen to this. Women received back their dead by resurrection, and others were tortured, not accepting their release so that they might obtain a better resurrection. Others experienced mocking and flogging, and further, chains and imprisonment. They were stoned, they were sawn in two, they were tempted, they were put to death with the sword. They went about in sheepskins, in goatskins, being destitute, afflicted, tormented, wandering in deserts, on mountains, and sheltering in caves and holes in the ground. But in the middle of that description of all those people who were suffering for their faith, there is a parenthesis, there's an insert, an editorial comment that is absolutely stunning. In the middle of that description of these colossal human failures, it's describing all these people, and the editorial comment says this: they were people of whom the world was not worthy. You see, earlier in that chapter, God has said, these kinds of people, I'm not ashamed to be called their God. As we move in a direction toward the persecution of Christian believers, and frankly, depending on the election in November in the United States, the timetable toward that persecution may be moved up significantly. But as we prepare for the day when physical persecution is our lot in life, remember that it is not the earthly evaluation that is important to us. It is living a life of faith in such a way that God says, I'm not ashamed to be called their God. And the editor, the writer of Hebrews said, these are people of whom the world is not worthy. Here's your decision, and you have to make it in advance, because when the time arrives, it won't be time to sit down and figure it out. You have to already know. Do you want the comfort that comes with the approval of the surrounding culture? Or are you willing to live by faith because the world is not worthy of you and God is pleased to be called your God? Decide now, because frankly, the time is at hand. This is Truth Currents.